So, with that, you might have heard that there's a legislative session going on. We are apparently sitting in the balcony. We're really doing this.
Really nice seats from up here.
We're really doing
a lot of activity
screen
down on the floor earlier today, Clay.
Yeah, that is not the source of our technical issues, if there are any. The green screen's great. We're happy to be. It's like we're the Muppet guys sitting in the balcony.
Speak for yourself, Clay. Speak for yourself.
The legislature. So let's get straight to the chase. The man next to me needs no introduction. He's John Carlton. If you've been to any safety trainings at any point, you've probably seen him and heard him. He's going to explain what the legislature is going to do with his prognostication powers. He's going to give us the lay of the land and how things are going at the very least, and hopefully a little bit of how things are going for ESDs. John, I'm just going to really, you get no introduction.
Thank you so much. Well, it's great to be sitting up here in the balcony. I haven't had this nice of a seat in quite some time, but let's talk a little bit about where we are with the legislative session. Remember when we talked at the conference, the session was starting January 8th. We're now 63 days in out of 140, so reaching the halfway point. The good news is that all of the bills that can be filed in the regular course of business had to have been filed by this past Friday, which is why we're talking to you today. I've been working through the legislation that's been filed. We're working on keeping up with that information for you. And I will make sure we'll talk about how many bills we're at and the kind of data that we've been working to push through. But that deadline was Friday. So we'll now move into bills being referred out to committees and committees conducting hearings. There have been some hearings going on already, but the real heavy lifting starts today. So if I can get the next slide, then we'll talk a little bit about how many bills have been filed. Next slide. Oh, I got to do this. I can do it. Okay, well then great. There we go. So in the 86th legislature right now, we have 4,629 House bills and 2,441 Senate bills. Now remember, those are different. The joint resolutions that I have listed here on the slide also are constitutional amendments, but it's a whole lot of stuff that's been put in the mixer for right now. Let's compare that to last session. Last session we had a total of 4,333 bills in the House and 2,300 in the Senate. Roughly 18% passed and about 50 were vetoed by the governor. I wanted to show you something that was interesting with respect to where we are in the process compared to prior sessions. The issue is, let's skip, I had a nice graph. There we go. So if you look over the last 4 sessions, 3 back from here to the 83rd, there were almost 6,000 total bills filed. However, you can see the big bulk of the bills that are filed is that large blue column in the bottom, or graph in the bottom. Those are the bills that did not pass. Only the green swath is what passes. Now there's a tiny line you can't see up there, which are the number of bills that are vetoed. But roughly we expect out of the 7,000 bills that have been filed for about 1,200 to 1,300 bills to actually pass this session. So the issue is we're tracking a whole lot of stuff and reviewing a whole lot of information that's becoming incredibly easy to file in the digital age to get down to those 1,200 to 1,300 bills that might pass, and then to focus within those on the bills that impact ESDs. So the next slide is just the raw numbers on that information, and let's go to the next one because this sets out why we're on the clock now. Remember, we're at day 63. Monday, May the 6th is the 119th day. That's the last day for committees to report out information. So we've got a little less than 60 days for the committees to do their work in the House on all of these bills and report them out. Now the bills get read first in the House and get assigned to a committee. Once that happens, then they need to come back from the committee for second reading. The deadline for that second reading is May the 9th. Then the following deadline occurs on May the 10th, which is the last day to consider third reading. Third reading is when the House actually passes a bill out sends it over to the Senate. Now this is for House bills, so we're running up on the clock here. Then the local bills, which don't have a deadline for filing of the 60th day, could be considered through the 17th. After that, we get into the crunch time of the last 2 weeks of session. House committees have to report Senate bills by the 17th, and then House has to consider second reading Senate bills by the 21st. So the Senate bills get a bit of a jump over in the Senate, move to the House, and are actually handled last after the House bills. After that, our deadline becomes May 22nd for the House to hear their House bills on third reading, and then we have on May 27th sine die, which is the last day for the legislature to do anything. However, really it's the Friday prior to that at midnight when bills begin to die, because Saturday and Sunday become merely housekeeping type of effort. And if you're not through the process by then, you're dead. You're dead. So the next 60 days is crunch time to get bills heard, and we'll be moving through. The way we approach the legislative session for safety is that we take a look at the legislative agenda that was set. And I've been over the legislative agenda with you through several different presentations, but as a reminder, let's talk about the fact that safety will be working with the leadership in the House. Their focus on both the Senate and the House side is property tax reform and school finance. There are 495 bills that have been filed amending the tax code related to taxation. There's about 48 related to school finance. Now, those kind of tangentially have an impact on us, but certainly those are the drivers for the session right now. Once we get into then our legislative agenda, we have to kind of work around those hot regular session issues. Our legislative agenda, and I get my direction from our legislative committee, which is your safety board president and several other members of the safety board who have helped kind of polish and work through your suggestions through the year. Now remember, our legislative agenda is that we are prioritizing ensuring that we will work to find legislative outcomes that help our emergency service districts provide that first line of defense in their communities. We are created by voters. We want to be a more reliable funding source for our fire protection and EMS. And then as a result of all of that, our primary function, right, is to save lives and protect property. And in order to do that, our focus for the session is really to make sure that we have a predictable, reliable, adequate level of revenue and oppose any efforts that might diminish or somehow negatively impact our ability to provide those services. That vision has driven our agenda. Number one on the agenda across the board from everyone was oppose property tax reform that would restrict our ESDs from accomplishing their mission. Now I want to talk a little bit about what property tax reform is, because we've taken a position at the Capitol that is not just an outright no on property tax reform. So property tax reform, as it's envisioned by the legislature, essentially has three components. The first component is visibility. Visibility is the new word instead of transparency. And as it's been described at the Capitol, visibility means we want people to see the process, not be able to see through the process. But we always want to catch on to those key words that the legislators have. Essentially what that means is they're trying to work on simplifying the notice so that voters and property taxpayers understand how their tax rates are set. There seems to be large confusion because people go to their appraisal district to complain about their taxes, when in fact they need to be talking to the political subdivisions about taxes. Safety's position on the visibility component is that we support visibility. We want our residents and our voters to be able to know the services we're providing and how we're providing them. The second component for property tax reform is the appraisal process. Safety's not taking a position in the appraisal process. That is really just an effort by the legislature to somehow better ensure the integrity of the valuation process that goes on for property values. The third piece is where we do get involved, and the third piece is the rollback rate. The goal of the legislature, with the bills that have been filed, is to limit the growth of the overall tax burden on folks. That means making sure that that 8% rollback rate is somehow reduced so that people don't bear this ever-increasing burden of higher levels of taxes. Now, there's a huge discussion going on, and while the Senate has moved Senate Bill 2 out of committee, it's not had a floor vote yet. There are a lot of discussions behind closed doors talking about how to make changes to that bill in the Senate. Haven't seen it come up yet for a floor debate. It'll be interesting to see when it does. The House version of the bill is currently pending in House Ways and Means. Now, House Ways and Means is chaired by Dustin Burrows, used to be chaired by the Speaker Dennis Bonnen, and Speaker Bonnen put Dustin Burrows in charge. That bill started the same as Senate Bill 2, but there's been a lot of discussion about how House Bill 2 should be modified. There were hours and hours and hours of testimony. Folks from the Texas Municipal League were testifying about how they wanted to work to find a workable solution for property tax reform, particularly with respect to that rollback rate. SafeD has taken a position that we provide essential services, fire and EMS protection. That's all we do. As a result of that, our position on the bill is, you know what? You need to find a way to allow us to continue to increase our funding levels adequate to keep up with growth in our communities, to provide the services that people voted to put us in place to provide. That could appear somehow in some form of a carve-out, whether it's based on taxable value, could be based on some exemption from the new rollback process, but that's yet to be seen, and I think those discussions continue to occur. We're involved in that. There are several lobbyists working for ESDs along with me down at the Capitol, and we'll continue to keep you informed. But keep talking to your local legislators and senators and letting them know that you're concerned that the things that they do would somehow reduce your ability to provide service. If we can stay focused on that, that's the goal, is to say, hey, look, we understand the need for this reform, but don't reduce our ability to get funding for these critical first responder services. So I want to move on. Property tax reform's big hot button, but let's move on to kind of our second portion of our legislative agenda, which really relates to sales tax revenues. And there have been some interesting proposals down there on sales tax revenue. There are a couple of bills actually filed to go above the local 2% cap. Now, you may remember when ESDs look at access to sales tax, we're stuck with what is a statutorily limited 2% sales tax cap. There are some bills out there that propose allowing sales tax above that local 2% to offset property taxes. There's one in particular directed at counties that would allow counties to take advantage of that. What we're tracking those bills for is to make sure it doesn't somehow dig into or eliminate the 2% that's currently available to ESDs. And so it's an interesting prospect that we might move from a property tax-based system to a more sales tax-supported system. And I haven't seen anything yet in the process that would eliminate or somehow negatively impact the ESD's ability to get sales tax. But we are monitoring those bills to make sure that nothing changes and that we're involved in the conversation. So there hasn't been anything filed yet, but we'll keep an eye on and keep you informed. So the next part of our legislative agenda was to propose and support legislation to allow ESDs to provide mobile integrated healthcare or community paramedicine. There was a really good session at the conference about this type of program. And if you weren't able to listen to it, essentially what it means is we allow our ESDs that are involved in EMS to get out in front of the 911 calls to reduce the burden on the system so that ambulances and folks aren't running on an emergency basis to someone who may not be actually using the 911 system for what its intended purpose was. The bill that has been filed was filed by Representative James White. James is out of Representative White's out of East Texas. He's chairman of another committee, but he was very interested in this topic and very interested in how to help ESDs save costs and prevent that unnecessary use of the 911 system. The bill is House Bill 3307. It is part of Safety's package. We do have two bills that we're pushing to pass. Essentially, it authorizes ESDs to provide what's called public health services. It frankly is a little broad right now. Public health services is already defined in another area in the Health and Safety Code. And so it taps these 6 things that you see on the slide as what public health services are. We can probably ratchet that back a little bit, but it's a starting point for the discussion, and it was well received by many of the members that I've spoken to. In fact, Representative Mary Gonzalez from El Paso area has signed on as a co-author on the bill. And so we've got both a Republican and a Democrat willing to push that, and I believe that Chairman Coleman is going to be supportive. He's always been a strong advocate for public health and finding alternatives to take care of folks in the community who don't have access to regular health care. And I believe he's supportive of not taxing the 911 system with that kind of unnecessary call volume. So we'll be working on that bill. Keep an eye on it. The next item on Safety's legislative agenda was to propose and support legislation to clarify ESD's ability to designate service providers. Now, Representative Dwayne Bohack from Western Harris County was gracious enough to support us in this effort. He's had some experience with his ESDs on the west side of Harris County, essentially with ESD being challenged about who's going to be the service provider in the area. The bill as proposed by Representative Bohack is House Bill 4350. It was filed on the next to last day. It clarifies that entities with jurisdiction in an area, whether that's a county, a municipality, or an ESD, that provide the service in the area, fire, EMS, whatever it may be, get to determine who gets dispatched by emergency communications districts. And there are about 6 different types of emergency communications districts that are responsible for receiving 911 calls and then processing them. And so by putting ESDs into this process and designating or consenting to who's going to be the service provider, we begin to create a system where the entities that tax and fund those services get to make the decisions about who the phone call goes to when a 911 call goes in. And so this bill pushes that forward. We're appreciative of Representative Bohack for filing it, and we look forward to processing it with him and having a successful legislative session with that bill. So House Bill 3307 and House Bill 4350 are the bills that Safety's supporting and proposing for this session. We get now to some other lower level things where we're going to support efforts by others to do some things like trying to simplify the reporting requirements. Now, supporting other people's efforts means that we're not actually filing a bill, but we're looking for bills that are doing what we want, and we want to help get those bills through. The challenge on the simplifying the reporting requirements, as you'll see on the next slide, is that frankly, there's more bills filed to expand reporting to other entities and other types of reports right now. There's really nothing filed as of now to reduce the number of reports. There are some bills out there, however, that could be used for that purpose, and our intention is to go talk with these members about what they're filing, what the paperwork and the reporting demands are being created by these bills, and see if we can't get some things consolidated to a more manageable level. It'd be great to report all of the information they're asking of us in one report to one agency rather than multiple times. So we'll keep an eye on those bills. Next, we want to support the efforts to increase funding for TIFMAS disaster response. Now, this is something in coordination with the State Firemen's and Fire Marshals Association. Had a conversation with their executive director today. Their funding for TIFMAS has been included in Article 3 of the budget. The budget is for the Texas Forest Service, and so that budget, interestingly enough, looks the same as the budget for the last biennium. There's about $23 million for funding for grants and another $1 million set aside for TIFMAS. Now, there are, however, some other funding sources that are being looked at, and so I want to pair this with our next legislative agenda item, which was to support that the process of getting the funds collected from insurance company assessments to get those out into the Rural Fire Department Assistance Fund, or the 2604 grants, and get those fully distributed. Towards that end, Representative Drew Springer out of North Texas has filed some riders, and riders are the ways that you affect the budget bill as a whole. So when you look at Senate Bill 1 or House Bill 1, which are the budget bills, those bills are very detailed, very long. Article 3 is where the Texas Forest Service is in those bills. And when you go in and look at the budget for the Texas Forest Service, that's where the dollar amounts are set out in terms of what's coming from the state's general fund, what's coming from the general fund as dedicated accounts, like the insurance money, and then what the expenditures are. A rider can go in and cause that money to be used for a particular purpose. And so Representative Springer is working hard to help the fire departments in the state get access to that unexpended $23 million and get that money out and used, and to fully allocate the existing money that comes in so that it can be used to support the fire departments in the state. So we'll be working closely with the State Firemen's and Fire Marshals Association. They've got a lobbyist. I've talked with their executive director. We look forward to that effort. Last, we want to monitor. Monitor means we're just keeping an eye on the horizon. We want to monitor the efforts about whether or not there's going to be a statewide agency created for firefighting efforts. Lots of different ideas are floating around about what that means. Does that mean a regulatory body? Does that mean a body that's helping coordinate emergency response? Different people have different ideas, and so as a result, there's some uncertainty. We've taken the position that we're just going to watch, see what the proposals are. If there's something that comes out, we'll evaluate it, come back to you, and let you know what we think. To date, there hasn't been anything filed to create that process that I've seen, but you never know. Something could be amended. There are some bills out there that are pretty broad vehicles, otherwise known as shell bills. A shell bill's got a caption that's broad enough to be able to include a wide variety of topics in it. So we keep an eye on those as well. And then I want to run down a few other bills that weren't necessarily associated with our legislative agenda, but relate to topics that have been important to us in the past. There have been a number of annexation bills filed. Annexation, as you recall, was reformed through Senate Bill 6, which was adopted during the special session in 2017. There are a number of bills filed to extend Senate Bill 6 to the smaller counties. If you attended Safety's conference on annexation, we talked about the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties. There's about 4 different bills that are filed that would eliminate that distinction so that every city in the state would be subject to these additional annexation requirements. There is a bill filed that would require consent from a city for an ESD to annex territory. We're paying close attention to that and evaluating it, trying to understand what the circumstances were surrounding that bill. There's also a bill that was filed again from last session to adjust compensation that's paid to an ESD by a city when annexation occurs. Essentially, it would change the calculation to take into account an area that might have been generating large sales tax for that ESD, since the current calculation is only based on property tax. There are a couple of bills related to collective bargaining. Not many of our ESDs are involved in Chapter 174 collective bargaining, but a few are. The 2 bills relate to requiring that salary be considered based on comparable fire department salaries, not just comparable private sector jobs. There are those folks who argue that there just aren't really any comparable private sector jobs to firefighters or folks in collective bargaining. Safety's position last session on that bill was really not to be opposed, but to be along in that process. The second collective bargaining bill requires binding arbitration. The Texas State Association of Firefighters is proposing that bill in order to avoid costs of litigation. Then let's move. There's a number of bills that I put in a category of employees and volunteers. Several bills have been filed talking about property tax exemptions for either disabled first responders or volunteer firefighters, things like that would find a way to benefit those folks who contribute their time or have dedicated their lives to providing service. There are also some bills to provide higher education fee waivers for disabled first responders, some jury duty exemptions, and some bills to try and tighten up confidentiality of employee information. We don't really want our first responders subject to harassment or terrorism if folks can get a hold of their personal information and find out where they live. So those bills are in the process. On the EMS side, a number of interesting things happening. There's a bill that's out there, but that's not listed here, relating to requiring air ambulance providers to cooperate with each other in the provision of that service. Be interested to see where that goes. There is a bill dealing with telemedicine, the ability to have a doctor over technology now help you while you're in the field providing EMS service. That'll be interesting to see. There's always a few bills related to changing licensing or certification requirements. But there's been a number of bills filed related to trauma funding, and there's a program called the Driver Responsibility Program where there's fees that are siphoned off of folks who get traffic tickets that funds a lot of trauma costs in the state. There's been a number of bills, and I think probably 10 filed, to eliminate that program and eliminate those fees, which could ultimately have an impact on the funding for trauma services in the state. It could be that money was being used to balance the budget and wasn't being out to those trauma centers anyway, but those bills are interesting and there's a lot of movement to eliminate that program. On the open government front, several things are out there. The most interesting might be that there's one that would allow posting on the internet in lieu of publication of notices that are required in other situations. So we'll keep an eye on all of those bills and keep you informed. There is a way for you to check on legislative reports, and I've got just the general safety website, but I think at the bottom of your screen, you've got a link to our high priority bills, the things that we think are the most important, and these are the high priority bills that were the most important prior to last week's deluge of bill filing. So we'll be updating that high priority list after we vet it with the Legislative Committee. And you can keep track of the bills that we're tracking by going to our website and continuing to check the link that'll be available throughout the rest of the session. In the alternative, you also have the ability to track and research some of this legislation yourself. If you're interested in things that aren't related to safety, you might be able to find other legislation. Go to the Capitol website, www.capitol.state.tx.us. You can set up and use the Texas Legislature's website to follow legislation and do that yourself. That's a quick run through 7,000 bills.
That was great. You got through them pretty quickly, all of them.
We have a list. I'm probably tracking right now 150.
Okay.
And working on distilling a few more. Okay. That list will be available, I think, within the next week. The full list of bills by subject matter, and so everybody can know kind of maybe what to keep an eye on. Frankly, if you have bills that you're interested in, that you think we might be interested in, I'd love to hear it, because we can go in and review and assess and decide whether something's more significant. I've had a couple of members already reach out and ask, hey, what about this bill? What about this bill? And I've gone in and checked, and we've been able to pull some things that are interesting, at least to keep an eye on and watch to make sure nothing serious happens with them.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We have some time for questions, so I want to throw one more time the slide back up there on how you can go ahead and get questions to us. You can call us at 512-251-8101. Email us at the safety email, safety, SAFED, all one word, at texas.net. Texas is spelled out. You can text me right here in the studio. A few of you already have. 512-567-0857. Normal text messaging rates may apply. Please don't call that number while I'm trying to answer questions. And also, you can even fax us your questions. They actually go to an email now. It's an internet fax. 512-251-8152. Yeah, nobody actually uses a fax machine anymore.
I don't.
Okay, so let's get straight into the questions. Okay, first question that I have is about the property tax reform, because I want to try to simplify this make sure I know what I'm talking about, and hopefully that'll help some of our folks out there know what they're talking about, because they probably already know more. But if I know what I'm talking about, then everybody else definitely knows what they're talking about. So the rollback rate as currently constituted is 8%, right?
Correct.
Now, the effective rate is the amount that would give you the same tax revenue as you had last year, right?
Generally.
On
the same,
I'm going to make some generalizations here.
So the effective rate is the rate that generates the same amount of tax revenue on the same property from year to year.
Same property.
So the effective rate doesn't include new property value, new growth.
So the basic idea is that, because the argument I hear from the folks who are in favor of the property tax reform and the revenue cap, as it has been called, and let's assume they're arguing in good faith, is that your effective rate gives you the same amount of money that you would have had last year. We're allowing for 2.5% increase on that rate. So we're even allowing you to go up more. Why do you need even more than that without going to the voters? How can we respond to that? Assuming it's a good faith argument, how do we respond to that?
Well, the challenge for providing emergency services is that we don't have the luxury of waiting for the value and the growth to actually occur to get our services in place. We actually have to have our stuff in the process. You can't get a fire truck in less than 6 months. You can't build a station in less than 2 years. And so to be ahead of that, you've got to be planning and projecting your costs out in advance. And 2.5% really just doesn't work in that situation. New growth is coming, but it's not there yet. In addition, our voters have already approved a 10-cent cap. And we bring that up with all the members that we talk to. There is no way for us to exceed that cap. It is constitutionally required. We're one of the very few entities that has a constitutionally set cap, and one of the rare that has one that low. And so essentially the discussion with the members has been, our revenues are low, our property tax is already capped. We had an election of all of our voters to go do this. We are first responders, critical frontline services. And so having us spend money to go to an election to exceed 2.5% when we know we're planning for growth, when we know we're planning for additional resources to provide critical services, that's just a choice on allocation of those funds when we're only able to go to 10 cents. And our 10 cents, if you run the calculations, is roughly less than 3% of your total property tax bill in general. And in most cases, if you live in an HOA, it's less than your HOA bill in terms of the cost and the insurance you get for those kinds of services. That's really what we're playing out. We're trying to work with the members to find a way to carve out those types of critical functions that we provide at the level of taxes that we have and the level of revenue that we have, so that we don't end up diverting money from our first responder services.
Right, because any money going towards an election, which is compulsory, and
correct,
compulsory even for those getting the...
Let's talk about that, because the bills as filed required that if you exceed 2.5% above the effective tax rate, you have to go to the voters for approval. Now the Senate bill, when it came out of committee, had an amendment on it because the bill as originally filed had a $15 million carve-out, so that if you had less than $15 million in property and sales tax revenue, which many of our ESDs have less than that, then you didn't have to go through that process, and your rollback rate was, instead of 2.5%, was 8%. Well, there was a committee substitute that was passed, and the committee substitute says, well, no, every county in the state, every entity in the state has to have an election, whether you're under that 15 million or not, for your voters to decide whether you get to be exempt from the mandatory 2.5% election. So the bill as coming out of the Senate committee requires that one-time election cost for everyone, regardless. And so once again, it becomes the question of, do we divert those resources from emergency services to having an election when we're already capped at 10 cents and our costs are really pretty low. The drivers are the larger entities. The school districts are the largest driver of property tax in the state by far, followed by some of the special districts that are created to fund water and wastewater service, and then you get to the cities and then the counties. We're way on down the line.
Right. So, under the Senate committee substitute, even our folks, we have some ESDs members that are out in East Texas and have less than $100,000 in yearly tax revenues. If they wanted to try to take advantage of the carve-out that would allow them to not have to be subject to the 2.5% and all the rules that go along with this Senate bill, they would still have to have an election, a one-time election, so they would still have to divert that money.
It's not even quite that, Clay. It is that they have to have an election, period. Not even if they want to take advantage of the carve-out. So everybody is required under the committee substitute from the Senate to have an election.
So they couldn't just say, okay, well, we'll be subject to the 2.5 and...
There is an election that will occur under the committee substitute.
Even for the larger districts who have over 15 million?
Well, no, they wouldn't.
Because they're automatic.
Correct.
But everybody, regardless of how they feel about dropping their rollback rate from 8 to 2.5, they have to have an election.
Correct. Under the Senate committee substitute version that's awaiting Senate intent on the floor.
That's an interesting provision. Anyway, enough said about that. Let's go on to the next question because
Now, let me point out, and I think and I want to make sure it's clear for all of our folks, the Senate and the House are handling this very differently. It's very much like last session. The House committee hearing was very long. Everybody who showed up got to speak for as long as they wanted. And the House is really taking in a lot of feedback to try and make sure they can adjust the bill appropriately. The Senate really pushed their version through to get it to the floor. It's really a difference between the two bodies, though. The Senate operates a lot differently from the House, and so the House version is going to take some while to germinate while in committee. They're taking amendments, so they were taking amendments through last week for it. They're going to process all of those, continue to be conversations. That will come back to the committee as a substitute, and then eventually, if it gets out of committee, go to the floor of the House. But I would expect that process to take a couple weeks before we even see that come out of committee.
The House bill.
The House bill. Yes. And I'm not sure that the Senate bill is going to move off this, get a vote on the Senate floor anytime soon. But we'll see.
Okay. And if it did, it would still have to go over to the House.
Correct.
So
correct.
There seems to be...
Which is what happened last session. The Senate version came over to the House, and the House took a very long time to deal with all of that. And it didn't actually end up moving
ultimately
back
too
over.
long of a time for that bill's fate.
Where it died.
I did want to say before we move on from the property tax reform, I think it was Travis County ESD 6 had a really good example of how that revenue would affect. They had a spreadsheet where you could kind of plug in your numbers, and we might be able to make that available. I don't know, producer, tell me if I'm out of nowhere, maybe. Anyway, they had a really good example, and so that may be something for your ESD to investigate is how would a 2.5% in terms of hard numbers affect your revenue that you're able to provide your first responders for your citizens over time? How would that affect you compared to the current status quo? Something to look into if you're concerned about the property tax reform bills that are possibly going through. Anyway, let's move on. I wanted to talk about House Bill 4350 really quick. That's the, as I call it, jurisdictional exclusivity. It's a mouthful, but I think it sums it up pretty well. Basically, what we've wanted to do, and that's, again, safety is behind this effort, is we want to make it clear in statute that says the ESD has the right to say who provides the service to its citizens. The concept is the citizens created the ESD. They said this is how we want our services provided. The ESD should get to decide how that service is provided, who the service provider is, that kind of thing. We've had some questions. I don't need to roll into all the different dramatic situations we've seen happen across the state over the last few years where that's become a question. Now we would like it in the law where we could actually point to the Texas statutes and say this is how it works. Now, where would that? I haven't actually gotten to read the bill. You have something you want to say?
So the bill is designed to take advantage of existing process. The 911 system in the state, there's a lot of regulation from the point where the person who wants 911 to answer, they pick up the phone. That call is regulated all the way until it gets to the emergency communication district, the entity that's responsible for then shifting the call out. Once that call is shifted out, though, there's really not much legislation to deal with it. There's one type of emergency communication district that has to get the consent of a city or a county on who it's going to dispatch. But there are about 6 different types of emergency communication districts in the statutes. And so what we've done is created a bill that defines the entities that can make that request or provide that consent on who provides service to include ESDs. So cities, counties, and ESDs now have the right to be in that process of deciding who gets dispatched from the emergency communication districts and how those calls get sent out. What that means really is that if you're the entity that's providing fire service, statutorily, you have to be involved in the process of talking with that emergency communications agency about who they're going to send to that call. And so it just puts us in the loop statutorily. It's very much like what we did with, if you recall, when there was questions over ownership of assets. If you were to go to court today on this issue of does an ESD have the right to say who's the provider, the courts ultimately would answer yes. But it's not really crystal clear in the statutes. And so this provides that statutory basis to look at if you had to show a provider or ultimately show a court and say, look, this is where we have authority to say who's going to answer the call in our area. That's the purpose behind the bill.
Okay. And so what statute does that actually put it in?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Well, you don't have to give me the exact number. I'm asking, is it the one that governs, it's not 775.
It is not 775.
It's the one that governs Emergency Communications District?
It is.
Our producer's doing wild hand gyrations to try to tell us the number.
So it is not the ESD statute. It is instead in 772 of the Health and Safety Code, which is where the emergency communications district are dealt with. Okay. And it actually follows through in 6 different sections of that code because there are 6 different areas and types of communications
6 different
districts.
Types of ECDs.
Right.
Is that what they call themselves?
Correct.
Do they have their own conference and association?
I don't know, but we should maybe invite them to communicate with us.
Maybe. Okay. I want to go jump back to, because it's a question about property tax reform that I just got in texted. What are some examples of amendments to House Bill 2 that are under consideration in committee? And I want to say, hi, Paula. Hope you're doing well.
Hi, Paula. Hope you're doing well.
Examples of the amendments to HB 2.
So there are no official amendments out there for HB 2. There are discussions going on about things like, is the $15 million carve-out appropriate? Should that number be higher? Should it include sales tax or not? That number could move upwards to exclude more entities. That number could be property tax only, as it was last session. There's also some discussion about whether 2.5% is the appropriate number. And in fact, I think really the 2.5% number is likely to go higher through this process. Where it ends up, I don't know. Historically, the proponents of the 2.5% say, hey, that's where we started before we moved to 8% back in the late 70s when inflation was so high. And so there's a balance of where that number is going to end up. There have also been some potential discussions about whether or not entities could perhaps save some of that percentage increase from year to year as a way to not encourage people to go to the maximum every year. If you didn't have to increase one year, maybe you banked some of your ability for a subsequent year. Haven't seen language on any of that. All of that's kind of in the mix, in the sausage factory right now, being discussed. And so, I think there's also potentially some discussions about whether particular entities get carved out. I don't know how likely that kind of thing is to occur, but all those things are possible.
Okay. We should ask them to carve out all ESDs.
It is a request that we can make and that we have made.
I mean, it's a possibility. I'm not saying we should.
Right.
I'm just saying it's a possibility.
It is a possibility.
It could be. It could theoretically.
It is possible to do that.
Put it in the language that says all emergency services districts are not subject.
That's
to
correct.
this.
That's correct.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Anyway. Let's move on to a couple more text questions that we had. If you had any more questions, please get them in. We're running a little short on time, but we wanted to make sure and get all the information out there. Okay, I want to try to...
But it is so nice up here in the balcony.
I know. I mean,
I'm kind of enjoying the evening, Clay.
It's kind of eerie that it's all
as I
empty
look down behind
yeah.
me, you would think there would be more activity back there.
You'd think.
It's
but,
early in the session.
Well, it's so late at night. They don't work this late.
Oh, yes, they do.
This early in the session?
Not this early in the session,
see,
but
there
yes,
you
they
go.
do.
In May, they'll work this early. Paula says thank you, by the way. We're wasting time. Okay, I want to try to answer this one. And then you can correct me if I'm wrong. What does TIFMAS stand for? And I think it's the Texas Intrastate, because interstate would be beyond Texas lines. So intrastate means within Texas, right?
You're the only one on the camera now. So.
Okay. Texas Intrastate Fire Mutual Aid System?
Yeah, there you go.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I don't know if Chief Wittig is watching, but he did a great presentation about TIFMAS, and he can correct me if I got that wrong, hopefully, if he's watching. I want to talk a bit about the TIFMAS and kind of sort of the joint SFFMA bills. The 2604, you had it in your PowerPoint about 2604 funds. Now, we referred to it in the PowerPoint as HB 2604. That's not for this session.
No.
Long
time
HB
ago.
2604 was passed a long time ago, but that's the one that created the Rural Volunteer Fire Department Assistance Fund program.
I believe so.
Assistance
Yes.
program. And that is the one where they take money from different sources, insurance. Is it fireworks? Is that the fireworks one? No?
No, this is off insurance.
Okay. This is off insurance, your insurance bill. It goes into this fund, and that's supposed to be divvied out to the rural fire departments as grant money, and they've been sort of backlogging it, right? Backlogging, like they've been keeping. They haven't been appropriating. The legislature has to appropriate it, and they haven't been appropriating everything that's been in that account, right?
Right. Correct.
And so Senator Springer? Representative Springer.
Representative Springer.
Representative
he would
Springer.
love being a senator at some point, but not yet.
Representative Springer, before I just promoted him, would like to, his bill would make that appropriation larger.
So he's got riders that he has filed onto the state budget bill that would increase the appropriation to fund those 2604 grant monies for the rural fire assistance.
Okay.
And so that just means he's trying to increase more appropriation. The budget currently has that $1 million. He's trying to, I think, increase that to $3 million.
Okay.
I think. I haven't seen the rider language itself yet, but like I said, we're working with SFFMA to help them get that. And the bigger chunk is the money that's sitting back, being used to balance the state budget, the $23 million.
Right.
Releasing that money is really the key.
He's not trying to release all of that right now.
Well, I think he's trying to make sure that it all is available for use.
Okay.
And then going forward, that money continues to be available.
Okay. Somebody just texted Merry Tifmas to me. So Merry Tifmas to you too. I hope we get the money.
It'll be Merry Tifmas on
if
May 27th.
Yeah, if they can get the more money for that crucial effort that we've seen deployed unfortunately so many times. We've needed them. We've needed that effort recently. Let me go back to, we're running a little out of time. Also, Mark Jack said I did get it correct on the TIFMAS.
Good to know that the president says you got it correct.
When the president says I did something good or correct, that's good. President of Safety, Mark Jack. Okay, let's talk about the municipal consent in the annexation. That bill that's been filed is basically dropping as I understand it, the municipal consent language from the creation, in 775, it says you have to go through a process to get municipalities to consent to have their city limits or ETJs in your ESD when you're creating them. My understanding is this bill, and I believe it's Representative Thompson, not Sinfronia Thompson.
Correct. Ed Thompson.
Ed Thompson. I was blanking on his first name.
In the Pearland area.
In the Pearland area, wants to make it where that municipal consent process, the ESD would now have to go through that same sort of process in order to annex into a city limits or
ETJ.
Or ETJ. Is that pretty much?
That's pretty much it. Now, it's interesting. This is a reprise of a bill that we dealt with, I want to say 4 or 5 sessions ago with Fort Worth and Parker County ESDs that were annexing and ended up with Fort Worth ETJ and some things like that. We had lots of conversations. We ended up reaching an accord with TML about that. My understanding of the situation that's caused the bill to come about this time is that there were some folks in the ETJ of that city that wanted not to be annexed by that city, but instead wanted to be served by the fire department in the ESD. And so they petitioned to be included in the ESD. And the city was not happy about that. They thought that they had the ability to offer fire service. Interestingly, this bill almost plays to undo a little bit of the annexation reform by giving the city that ability to make a determination about how its ETJ or how its residents are provided service when they should be able to kind of decide where they go themselves.
Okay.
The petition process is an election into the ESD, so everybody's got to vote on whether they move into the ESD or not. They can decide not to if they want to be in the city. Either way, it's a little different from the city consent process on creation from my perspective, because at the outset of creating a district, the city's making a decision: are we going to provide service or not?
Right.
Right. And so in this situation, it's not accurately solving the problem that occurred.
So is there no, because in the creation process of 775, it says if the city declines consent, the citizens can request services through a petition process to the city. Right. Is that not included?
But essentially, if the city declines consent, they hold the community hostage as to who the service provider is going to be. Right. And being able to be, it's another way to get at annexation by a municipality potentially.
Interesting. Okay, so that could undo some.
And we've had preliminary discussions about that bill. I've talked with Representative Thompson's staff. Representative Thompson's a super gentleman, a really straightforward, straight shooter kind of guy, and it's just a matter of, in the legislative process, continuing to have conversations about what we're trying to solve and what's the best way to do that.
Okay, good deal. So we're on top of that one. I wanted to go to, okay, so we've got a couple issues out of Bear, basically.
Yeah, we do. I forgot to mention. There's a bill to elect the Bear County ESD commissioners.
Before we get to that one, I know this issue came out of Bear, but it looks like Parker is also chiming in on it. Is there any movement on having an opportunity for ESDs to repeal the utility exemption for sales tax? Now, I thought we got clearance that they could. Is that not true?
So there's not a bill currently filed addressing that topic. It was an issue that we began discussing kind of late. Really, the deadline for getting stuff in the hopper to be drafted was about a month ago. And so there's not anything currently in the process for that. There may be some vehicles that make it available, and we'll keep looking for those things.
Okay.
But right now, there's not a bill specifically addressed.
Okay. And also, I guess we should talk about the Bear County.
We should talk about the Bear County elected commissioners. There, Bill, I forgot to mention, and I apologize for those of you in Bear County. There is a bill filed by a representative from Southern Bear County to propose that all ESD commissioners in Bear County be elected. I've spoken with the folks working with the commissioners, the county commissioners court in Bear County. It's not their bill. I think they actually like having the control and the ability to oversee the ESDs by appointing commissioners. So I'll be curious to see whether that piece of legislation goes anywhere. I've had a conversation with a staff member of the House member that's filed that bill, and it's Leo Pacheco is the House member that's filed the bill. And I've had conversations with the folks from Bexar County. So I'm not sure where that goes. Our position on elections is always one of there are pros and cons both ways, right? Mm-hmm. There are pros to being elected. The folks in Harris County, y'all have got years of experience with that. Our multi-county ESDs are elected, lots of years of experience. We've got Smith and Orange County that are elected. Interestingly, there are multi-county districts that don't want to do elections because they're such a pain to process. So we've got bills where we've undone the ability to elect in multi-counties for a particular district here or there. Our goal in all of that is to provide information, lay out what the pros and cons are, and help folks decide how they're going to handle that in their area.
Right. So that's sort of the short version of safety and elected versus appointed ESD commissioners.
Yeah, I mean,
and we will watch that bill and try to figure out what exactly is going on. We got to wrap up. Okay, two things before I wrap up. One, just so we're clear on this utility exemption thing, there might be an opportunity to attach an amendment somewhere to one of these sales tax bills.
Right.
Possibly.
We're watching potentially sales tax bills and what I referred to early on as shell bills, bills that are broadly drafted captions that can accept a lot of different topics.
Okay, good. I think Chief Watson will be happy to hear that. And let's see. Oh, and this was a good one, and this will be our last question. For tax reform laws to take effect, the Senate bills and House bills have to be exactly the same ultimately, right?
Well, okay, so
let's talk about
it's a matter of
committee.
semantics.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. The Senate bill and the House bill will not both pass.
Right.
One version or the other will pass, but the other chamber has to approve a version of the bill. If the chambers approve different versions of the bill, it goes to conference committee, and 10 members of the legislature decide how to negotiate that outcome. That then has to go back to the two chambers for them to approve. That's how that bill would have to ultimately pass.
So if HB 2 passes the House, it goes over to the Senate. The Senate can then mess with it a little bit and amend it, and if that happens and it does pass the Senate as amended, they've got to appoint a committee.
The House can choose to concur or refuse to concur in those amendments. If they refuse to concur, a conference committee can be appointed.
This happened on some hot topic legislation last year. It might have been the property tax.
That happens on lots of them. You'd be surprised.
Where somebody refused to appoint conferees or something to the conference committee, and then it dies. So,
yes.
So with that, there is a possibility even there. A lot of opportunities for legislation to not make it. Right.
There's only one way to pass a bill, and there's about 1,000 ways to kill them.
There you go.